Have you ever sat in a room full of people, understood exactly what was happening around you, saw every pattern, predicted every outcome before it occurred, and still felt more alone than anyone else there? Most people assume that a very high IQ is a gift with no strings attached, that intelligence is simply power, clarity, and advantage packaged into a single trait. But the psychological reality of living with an exceptionally high IQ is far more layered, far more paradoxical, and far more quietly painful than almost anyone talks about. There is something happening inside the minds of highly intelligent people that most of the world misreads entirely, and that misreading costs them connection, peace, and sometimes their well-being. What is actually going on beneath the surface, and why does extreme intelligence so often come wrapped in a kind of loneliness that no amount of knowledge can solve? Here is what almost no one explains when we talk about extremely high IQs. Raw cognitive ability and emotional ease are not the same thing, and they frequently move in opposite directions. When psychologists and researchers study individuals whose IQ scores fall above 130, 145, or even 160, they are not simply studying people who are better at math or faster at reading. They are studying people whose entire way of processing the world, emotionally, socially, perceptually, operates at a fundamentally different frequency than the majority of those around them. The clinical term sometimes used is overexcitability, a concept developed by the Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski, which describes the heightened intensity with which highly intelligent individuals experience not just ideas, but emotions, sensory input, imagination, and interpersonal dynamics. Their nervous systems, in a very real sense, are turned up louder than average. And you may be experiencing something close to this right now. Not necessarily because you have a genius-level IQ, but because intelligence exists on a spectrum, and many of the psychological patterns associated with high cognitive ability are more common than society acknowledges. The feeling that your mind never fully quiets down, the sense that conversations rarely go deep enough, the exhaustion of having to translate your inner world into language others will accept. These are not just personality quirks. They are documented psychological experiences with real names and real explanations. Once you understand them, everything shifts. What makes this topic so important is that these patterns tend to manifest in specific, recognizable ways that highly intelligent people often interpret as personal failures rather than byproducts of the way their minds are built. And that misinterpretation is where a great deal of unnecessary suffering begins. In this video, we are going to explore 8 psychological patterns that are consistently found in people with extremely high IQs, patterns that explain not just how they think, but how they feel, how they struggle, and why the world so often misunderstands them. Stay until the very end, because the final patterns are the ones most rarely discussed, and they may be the ones that resonate most deeply with your own experience. Pattern 1. Chronic intellectual restlessness. The first and perhaps most universal characteristic of people with very high IQs is a mind that simply does not stop, and more specifically, a mind that cannot be satisfied with shallow engagement. This is not merely enthusiasm or curiosity. It is a neurological condition in which the brain's reward system is calibrated to seek deeper and deeper levels of stimulation in order to produce the same sense of engagement that ordinary tasks provide for others. Think about what this actually means in practice. A highly intelligent person sitting through a meeting that covers ground they understood 10 minutes ago is not being impatient or arrogant. They are experiencing a form of genuine cognitive deprivation, the mental equivalent of being asked to stand still in a room that is slowly running out of oxygen. Their brain is built to process information rapidly, cross-reference it against vast internal frameworks, and push immediately toward the next layer of complexity. When that progression is blocked, the discomfort is real and physical, not imagined. What often follows is a pattern of behavior that others misread as inconsistency. The highly intelligent person who starts dozens of projects and finishes few of them, not because they are lazy, but because the moment of genuine intellectual stimulation, The moment they understand something new has already passed. Their interest was always in the discovery, not the execution. This pattern, when not recognized, leads to years of self-criticism and a quiet belief that something is broken in the way they approach commitment. But understanding its origin changes the story entirely. It is not a character flaw. It is a brain doing exactly what it was built to do, in an environment not always designed to accommodate it. And once you recognize the restlessness, you begin to notice how it bleeds into something even more fundamental, the way highly intelligent people relate to the people around them.
Pattern 2. Deep and often painful social loneliness. There is a specific type of loneliness that is almost impossible to explain unless you have felt it. Not the loneliness of having no one around you, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still finding that none of the conversations touch anything real. For people with extremely high IQs, this experience is not occasional. It is frequently the dominant texture of their social lives. Psychologist Lita Hollingworth, who was among the first to study profoundly gifted children in the early 20th century, documented what she called the problem of communication, the observation that individuals whose IQ is more than 30 points above the average of those around them face what amounts to a social translation barrier. The gap is simply too wide for natural connection to form easily. It is not arrogance that creates the distance. It is the effort of constantly translating the speed of your thinking, the complexity of your references, the assumptions you do not share, the conclusions you have already drawn by the time the other person is still framing the question. What makes this pattern so painful is that it compounds over time. The highly intelligent person learns, often in childhood, that being fully themselves in social settings creates discomfort, not always their own, but the discomfort of others who feel excluded, shown up, or simply unable to keep pace. And so they learn to perform a simplified version of themselves. They learn to hold back. They become, in a sense, bilingual, fluent in their own internal language and simultaneously fluent in whatever register the room around them requires. That act of constant translation is exhausting in a way that is hard to articulate, and it leaves a residue, a persistent sense that no one truly knows them, even when the room is full. This social loneliness is almost always present, but it tends to coexist with something equally paradoxical, an extremely rich and demanding inner world that both compensates for social isolation and deepens it. Pattern 3. Intense inner world and emotional depth. Contrary to the popular image of the highly intelligent person as someone coldly rational, the psychological research paints a very different picture. Individuals with extremely high IQs tend to experience emotions with an unusual intensity. They feel joy more acutely, grief more completely, injustice more viscerally, and beauty more overwhelmingly than average. This is the phenomenon Dabrowski described as psychic overexcitability, and it is not a poetic metaphor. It reflects genuine differences in how the nervous system processes and amplifies experience. What this means in day-to-day life is that a piece of music does not just sound pleasant, it unlocks something almost architectural in the mind, a structural experience of sound that carries real emotional weight. A conversation does not just convey information, it carries layers of subtext, implication, and meaning that the highly intelligent person is tracking simultaneously. An ethical problem is not just abstract, it is felt physically as a kind of urgent moral pressure that does not resolve easily. This emotional depth is rarely visible from the outside because highly intelligent people often develop sophisticated mechanisms for managing and concealing it. They learn early that showing the full range of their emotional responses tends to confuse or overwhelm others. So they become skilled at appearing composed, analytical, and detached, while internally processing at a volume that would surprise most people who know them. The cost of that concealment is a chronic feeling of being fundamentally unseen, visible in performance, invisible in experience. This richness of inner life connects directly to one of the most misunderstood patterns in people with very high IQs, the relationship they have with what is sometimes called the imposter experience. Pattern 4. Imposter syndrome at its most paradoxical. It might seem counterintuitive that the people with the highest cognitive ability would be among those most likely to doubt whether they truly belong, truly deserve their accomplishments, or truly know as much as others assume they do. And yet the research is consistent. High IQ individuals experience imposter syndrome at remarkable rates, and there is a specific reason why. When your intelligence is genuinely high, you are acutely aware of everything you do not know. You can see with unusual clarity the vast landscape of complexity that lies beyond your current understanding. You are aware of your assumptions, aware of your gaps, aware of the contingency of your conclusions. Meanwhile, people of average intelligence, having less visibility into that landscape of complexity, tend to feel more confident precisely because they do not see what they are missing. This is related to what psychologists call the Dunning-Kruger effect, the cognitive bias where limited knowledge in a domain produces inflated confidence, while greater expertise produces more calibrated, often more cautious self-assessment. The result is a cruel inversion. The person with the highest cognitive ability sits in the room feeling the most uncertain about their own standing, while those who have thought less deeply about the problem speak with the most certainty.
For the highly intelligent person, this pattern produces years of second-guessing, reluctance to claim expertise, and a persistent interior voice that insists they are somehow getting away with something, that people will eventually discover the gaps they are acutely aware of. Managing that voice, especially in competitive or high-stakes environments, is one of the quieter but more exhausting experiences of living with extreme intelligence. And the very same perceptiveness that produces imposter syndrome tends to generate a related and equally difficult experience, an almost involuntary detection of dishonesty, manipulation, and social performance in others. Pattern 5. Hyper-detection of inauthenticity. People with very high IQs tend to process social information with unusual speed and depth. They pick up micro-expressions, inconsistencies between words and body language, shifts in tone that do not match the stated content, and the subtle gap between what someone says they believe and what their behavior actually reveals. This is not a deliberate skill they cultivate. It is simply a byproduct of a mind that processes pattern and contradiction at high speed. What this creates is a heightened sensitivity to inauthenticity. The highly intelligent person often knows before they can articulate exactly why, when someone is performing rather than being genuine, when a social consensus is built on pretense rather than shared belief, when an organization's stated values diverge from its actual priorities. This sensitivity is informative, but it is also socially isolating. It is very difficult to relax in environments you can see through. It is difficult to sustain superficial friendships when you can feel the distance between the performance and the person beneath it. And it is difficult to trust your own perceptions when the people around you consistently behave as though everything is fine and you are the one making it complicated. This last experience, the sense of seeing something real that others around you deny or ignore, is one of the most quietly destabilizing aspects of extreme intelligence. Over time, it tends to push highly intelligent people toward either deep cynicism about human nature or an almost desperate search for the rare environments and individuals where authentic connection actually feels possible. That search brings us to one of the more surprising patterns in the psychology of high IQ individuals, their complicated relationship with perfectionism and failure. Pattern 6. perfectionism rooted in possibility, not pride. Most people assume that perfectionism in highly intelligent individuals comes from arrogance, from a belief that they should be better than others and therefore cannot tolerate falling short. The actual psychological mechanism is almost the opposite. For people with very high IQs, perfectionism tends to emerge from an unusually vivid and detailed sense of what is possible. Because they can envision optimal outcomes with such clarity, the gap between what they produce and what they can imagine producing is experienced as a genuine and painful shortfall. The highly intelligent person is not comparing themselves to others and finding others insufficient. They are comparing their actual output to an internal model of the ideal output, and that internal model is extraordinarily demanding precisely because their cognitive capacity makes it so vivid and so specific. The musician who can hear in their mind exactly how the piece should sound, and who cannot close the gap between that internal sound and what their hands produce, is not being precious. They are experiencing something architecturally similar to the frustration of a master architect reviewing a building where the contractor deviated from the blueprint in ways only they can fully see. This form of perfectionism is paralyzing in a very specific way. It makes beginning difficult because beginning means committing to a process that is almost certainly going to fall short of the internal standard. It also makes finishing difficult because finishing means releasing something into the world before the gap between actual and ideal has been resolved. For many highly intelligent people, the graveyard of abandoned work, projects that reached a certain level of quality and then stalled because the next phase of development felt impossible, is one of the defining features of their creative and professional life. What lies just beneath the perfectionism and is rarely discussed is an entirely different relationship with boredom than most people experience. Pattern 7. A fundamentally different experience of boredom. Boredom is not a mild inconvenience for people with extremely high IQs. It is closer to a low-grade form of suffering, a genuine cognitive deprivation that produces restlessness, irritability, and a persistent sense that something essential is being withheld. This is because the highly intelligent mind requires genuine complexity to function at its natural register, and in the absence of that complexity, it does not simply idle, it begins to turn on itself. The highly intelligent person who is consistently understimulated does not become content and peaceful. They become anxious, self-critical, and sometimes destructive, creating drama or difficulty where none existed, because their mind requires something to engage with, and if no adequate external challenge is available, it will manufacture internal ones.
This pattern is widely misunderstood as a personality problem, as neediness, volatility, or a tendency to complicate things unnecessarily. The underlying cause is simply a brain running at a level of processing power that its environment cannot consistently absorb. What makes this particularly difficult is that highly intelligent people are often, from childhood, placed in environments specifically designed for the average range of cognitive ability, schools, workplaces, social structures, and told, implicitly or explicitly, to adjust their pace to the group. The long-term effect of this chronic understimulation is not adaptation. It is a kind of accumulated frustration that, if unexamined, gradually produces something far more difficult to manage, and that leads to the final pattern, the one that is most rarely discussed and perhaps the most important of all. Pattern 8. The weight of knowing what others have not yet seen. There is a particular cognitive burden that comes with being able to model systems, anticipate consequences, and identify problems before they materialize, a burden that has no precise name in popular psychology, but that appears consistently in the accounts of highly intelligent individuals. It is the burden of knowing. Not knowing in the abstract sense of having accumulated facts, but knowing in the lived sense of being able to see, with reasonable clarity, how a situation is likely to unfold, a relationship, an organizational decision, a social dynamic, a cultural trend, and finding yourself unable to share that perception in a way that others can receive without feeling threatened or dismissed. The highly intelligent person who says to a friend in the early weeks of a new relationship, "I think this person is going to hurt you in this specific way," is not being pessimistic. They are pattern matching against a complex set of signals that they have already processed. But delivering that perception at that moment in that way rarely ends well for the friendship or the prediction. What accumulates over years of this experience is a kind of learned silence, a decision, usually unconscious, to withhold the fuller picture of what one sees, because sharing it produces more friction than value. The highly intelligent person becomes very good at keeping the scope of their perceptions private. And this withholding, repeated across years and relationships and professional contexts, becomes its own form of loneliness. Not the loneliness of having no one around, but the loneliness of holding knowledge that does not easily translate into connection. Now that you have walked through these 8 patterns, take a moment before you move on, not to label yourself or create a new story about who you are, but simply to notice how many of these patterns do you recognize in yourself or in someone you know well. Because here is what the research makes clear. Many of these experiences, the chronic restlessness, the social translation fatigue, the emotional depth, the imposter doubt, the sensitivity to inauthenticity, the perfectionism, the boredom, the quiet burden of foresight, are not pathologies. They are not signs that something went wrong. They are the predictable psychological consequences of a mind that processes the world at a different speed and depth than the environment it was placed in. And when you understand the mechanism, the experience stops feeling like a personal failure and starts feeling like what it actually is, the natural result of a particular kind of mind navigating a world not always built to accommodate it. If any part of this video resonated with you, if you recognized yourself or someone you love in these patterns, share it with them. Sometimes the most important thing is simply to have a name for what you have always felt and to know that someone else sees it clearly. Understanding the psychology of high IQ is only the beginning of a much larger conversation, because once you see these patterns clearly, the next natural question becomes, what do highly intelligent people actually need in order to thrive, not just perform, not just survive their own minds, but genuinely flourish? That question leads into some of the most interesting research in psychology right now, and it is the subject of the next video on this channel. I have linked it at the end of this video and in the description below. It goes deeper into the environments, relationships, and internal practices that allow people with exceptional cognitive ability to live with something closer to ease. If you found this video valuable, that one will feel like the next chapter of the same story. Thank you for spending this time here and for engaging with a topic that genuinely matters, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a real reflection on the inner lives of people who are often seen but rarely understood. If this video gave you something, a new frame, a moment of recognition, a word for something you have felt but never named, please give it a like. It takes a second and it tells me that this kind of depth is worth continuing to create. And I would genuinely love to know your answer to this question in the comments. Which of these 8 patterns surprised you the most, and which one felt the most personally true? There is no right answer. I am asking because your experience adds something to this conversation that I cannot create alone. If you want more videos like this one, Psychology Made Real, Made Human, and Made Relevant to the life you are actually living, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you do not miss what comes next. I'm glad you're here.